They dismantled a dying Odyssey Warship. A human engineer rebuilt it into a weapon. The alarm was already blaring when I landed. I had not even stepped off the transport ramp before the Vreth foreman was in my face, all 8 limbs gesturing at once, his translator unit clicking and spitting broken sounds into the stale recycled air of Keth Nebula Scrapyard Station 9. He was telling me to leave. He had been telling me to leave for the last 3 minutes via emergency comm, while I was still aboard the transport, and now he was telling me in person, louder, with more limbs involved. I picked up my tool case and walked past him. The scrapyard stretched out ahead of me like a graveyard that nobody had bothered to mourn. Ships of a dozen different species sat in various states of dismemberment across the docking grid. Some were barely husks, some still had their running lights on, blinking slowly in the dark like the last signals of something that had not yet been told it was already dead. The air smelled like burned metal and something sweet that the Keth used as cutting fluid. It turned my stomach every single time I breathed it in. I had been here before, 2 years ago, on a different job. Back then I had been employed. Back then I had a rank on my sleeve and a clearance badge, and a reason to stand straight when someone looked at me. Now I had a toolkit that I had carried for 11 years, a single duffel bag with a change of clothes and 3 field manuals, and a 1-page contract signed by a Vreth Syndicate middleman who had not expected me to actually show up. The contract said I was hired to assess the remaining salvage value of United Earth Fleet Warship OW-7, designation Odyssey class, hull number 7 of 12. It said I had 72 hours to complete the assessment and submit a report. It said the Vreth Syndicate retained full ownership of all components, systems, and materials. It did not say anything about what I intended to actually do. I found her in Bay 41, at the far end of the docking grid, parked in the shadow of a collapsed Keth freighter that had been stripped down to its skeleton. She was big. Even in ruin, even with 3 full deck sections collapsed inward, and her hull plating scorched black along her port side, from something that had burned very hot for a very long time, she was still big. The Odyssey class had been designed that way. Not elegant, not sleek, not the kind of ship that other species pointed at and called beautiful. She was wide across the beam, thick-hulled, with a blunt forward section that looked more like a battering ram than a bow. She looked like something that had been built by people who fully expected her to take damage, and had designed every centimeter of her with that expectation in mind. Her name was still visible on the hull, just barely. Someone had tried to burn it off during decommission, and had not done a thorough job. The letters were half-melted, but readable if you knew what you were looking for. Odyssey. I stood there for a moment, and just looked at her. The Vreth foreman had followed me. His name was Sket, according to the badge clipped to his thorax plate. He was senior enough to have the silver thread rank marks along his upper limbs, which meant he ran this section of the yard, and had authority over what happened here. He stopped beside me, and for a moment neither of us said anything. "She is scrap," Sket said finally. His translator did a reasonable job with human language, though the rhythm was always slightly wrong, like a song being played at the wrong speed. "You see this. Your assessment will confirm this. Then you go." "Maybe," I said. "Not maybe. Reactor is dead. 2/3 of weapons array is fused. Deck 3 through 5 collapsed. Life support is non-functional. Navigation core is cracked. She is not a ship anymore. She is material." I set my tool case down, opened it, and pulled out my diagnostic probe. "Has anyone run a full subsystem sweep?" Sket made the sound that passed for a Vreth laugh. It was not a pleasant sound. "We ran primary sweep. It confirmed what the eyes can see. There is nothing here worth more than scrap weight." "Who ran it?" "Our technicians." "Vreth-trained technicians?" "Yes." I clicked the probe on and started walking toward the ship's access hatch. "Then you missed things." He followed me, all 8 limbs moving with the agitated speed of someone who was trying not to lose his temper. "Human arrogance," he said. "Always the same. Your species builds ships like you are afraid of everything. Too many layers. Too many backups. Too much weight. Our ships are efficient. Precise. We do not waste." I found the access hatch, which was sealed but not locked. Someone had broken the locking mechanism when they first boarded her after she was brought in. I pulled it open manually. The hinge groaned in a way that hurt my back teeth. You know what the problem with precise is? I said. Tell me. Precise means you built it exactly as good as it needs to be. Not 1 gram more. Not 1 layer more. Not 1 backup circuit more. And that works fine right up until the moment something goes wrong that you did not design for. I ducked through the hatch and let my eyes adjust to the darkness inside. We built her expecting everything to go wrong. That is not arrogance. That is experience. Inside, the Odyssey smelled like 11 years of cold vacuum, dust, and the particular kind of stillness that only very large machines develop when they have been sitting unused for a long time. My light swept across the corridor walls. Damage everywhere. Structural beams had buckled on the port side. The floor plating was warped and cracked in several places. Cables hung loose from the ceiling where something had torn through them. The whole place had the heavy, exhausted feeling of a living thing that had been through something terrible and barely survived it. But the walls were still standing. That was what mattered. I moved deeper in, past the collapsed entrance to Deck 3, past the sealed emergency bulkhead that had saved the forward sections from decompression when the aft section breached. My probe was reading as I walked, logging every system it could find, alive or dead, partial or complete. I was not looking at the readings yet. I was feeling the ship. You cannot explain this to someone who has not spent years working on machines. There is a sense you develop, a way of understanding what something is telling you that goes beyond what the instruments say. The Odyssey was telling me something. She was telling me through the pattern of her damage and the condition of her surviving structure, and the specific places where her builders had reinforced beyond the required spec, and the way her emergency bulkheads had triggered in exactly the right sequence to preserve the maximum amount of usable hull volume. She had been built by people who loved her. That sounds foolish. It sounds like the kind of thing someone says when they are being sentimental rather than practical. But it is not foolish, and it is not sentiment. When people who love what they build are the ones building it, they do things that are not required. They add a second support strut where one would do. They run a backup conduit along a route that makes no logical sense until the primary conduit is destroyed, and suddenly the backup is the only thing keeping the ship alive. They think about failure modes that are not in the specification, because they lie awake at night imagining them. I found the bridge on Deck 2, forward section, behind a sealed pressure door that took me 4 minutes and 2 different tools to open. When it finally swung back, I stepped inside and swept my light around. The bridge was intact. Damaged, yes. The main display panels were dark, and the helm console had a crack across its full width, and there was a long scorch mark across the ceiling from something that had burned inside the room at some point. But the structure was whole. The chairs were still bolted to the deck. The secondary control panels along the port wall were dark but undamaged. The navigation pod in the aft corner of the bridge was sealed, and, as far as my probe could tell through the casing, the core inside might still be viable. I sat down in the command chair. It was not comfortable. It had never been built for comfort. It was built to hold a person in place during rapid maneuvers and blast events. The armrests had integrated emergency controls. The back had a direct hardline port for a personal communicator. The whole thing was bolted to a reinforced deck section that had its own independent structural frame separate from the main bridge floor. Whoever had sat in this chair had been ready, at any moment, for the ship to be doing something violent. I pulled up my probe readings and started going through them. The reactor was in shutdown, as Sket had said, but shutdown was not dead. The Vreth technicians had read the shutdown status and assumed total failure because their diagnostic software was calibrated for Vreth reactor architecture, which used a completely different shutdown protocol. A Vreth reactor in full shutdown looked the same to a surface scan as a Vreth reactor with a melted core. The human engineers who designed this one had built the shutdown mode to mimic total failure on purpose. It was a security feature, designed to make a captured or disabled ship look more ruined than it was. If an enemy boarded her and ran a quick scan, they would conclude the reactor was gone and move on. The Vreth technicians had moved on. I looked at the power cell readings. The backup cells, 4 of them, distributed through the hull in locations that were not marked on any external schematic, were at 11% charge. That was 11 years of slow drain. But 11% of a full backup cell array on an Odyssey-class ship was still a usable amount of power. Not enough to run the ship. Enough to run diagnostics. I found the secondary power conduit junction, in the wall behind the navigation pod. It took me 20 minutes to cut the panel open without the right tools for that specific panel type. Inside was a junction box that looked exactly like every other junction box on every human ship I had ever worked on. The connections were corroded but not destroyed. The relay switches were in the safe position. There was a thin coating of frost on the interior surfaces from the long cold. But frost meant the seals had held. Frost meant the interior had been airtight. I made the connections I needed. I bypassed the primary control relay, which was definitely non-functional, and routed directly through the secondary. I pulled a power cable from my tool case, standard human universal gauge, the kind I had carried for 11 years because it fit into every human ship ever made, and connected it to the backup cell tap. The junction box clicked. One small light came on, red, then amber, then green. Somewhere deep in the ship, something woke up. Not the reactor, not the weapons, not life support. Just one small system, the one I had specifically targeted, because it was the one the Vreth technicians would never have thought to look for. It was not on their schematics. It was not on the official UEF technical release that the Vreth Syndicate had obtained when they purchased the decommissioned lot. It was in the field manual, Chapter 7, Section 9, a subsection titled Supplemental System Architecture, which described a secondary diagnostic network that ran through the structural frame of every Odyssey-class ship, completely independent of all primary systems, powered by its own dedicated cells, designed to give a recovery engineer a full picture of the ship's actual condition, even if every primary system was dark. The system had not been mentioned to the Vreth because it had not seemed relevant. The official decommissioned paperwork described it as dormant monitoring infrastructure with no operational value. My probe connected to it. And the Odyssey started talking to me. Not in words, in data, in thousands of small status readings and integrity reports, and power cell logs and sealed system statuses, all of it pouring into my probe in a continuous stream that my screen could barely display fast enough. I sat in the command chair in the cold and the dark, and I read everything she had to say, and the longer I read, the more my chest tightened with something that was not grief exactly, but was not entirely different from it either. She had fought. That was the first thing I understood. The battle damage pattern on her hull was not the pattern of a ship that had been caught helpless or taken by surprise. It was the pattern of a ship that had maneuvered deliberately under fire, that had turned to present her most armored face to incoming hits, that had continued functioning through damage that would have stopped other ships. The port-side burn pattern, the one that looked catastrophic from outside, was actually the result of a controlled energy bleed, a last-ditch heat dump through the hull plating to prevent a cascade failure in the power core. Someone had made that call deliberately. Someone had chosen to ruin the hull rather than lose the core. She had been brought home by someone who knew her very well. The structural integrity readings were better than they had any right to be. The collapsed deck sections were real collapses, genuine damage, not repairable by one person with a tool case. But the primary frame, the deep skeleton that everything else was attached to, was almost entirely sound. The Vreth had not found this because their structural scans assumed Vreth architecture, which put the primary frame at the hull. Human ships put the primary frame deeper in, threaded through the center of the ship like a spine. You had to know to look for it. You had to know what you were reading when you found it. The weapons array was listed as fused. This was partially true. The primary emitters on decks 4 and 5 were destroyed. Deck 4 and 5 had collapsed, so this was not surprising. But the secondary array, which the Vreth technicians had not found because it was routed through a channel that appeared on the schematics as a ventilation trunk, was intact. All 12 secondary emitters, sealed, powered down, safe behind the blast shielding that had been designed specifically to protect them if the primary array was destroyed. The navigation core was cracked. This was true. The crack was visible, and the primary crystal lattice was compromised. But the navigation system on this class of ship had a backup crystal, sealed in a separate housing, which could take over full navigation function if the primary was lost. The backup housing was undamaged. The crystal inside was whole. I sat there for a long time after I finished reading. Sket was waiting in the corridor outside the bridge. I had heard him following me through the ship, his limbs clicking on the floor, plating at a distance. staying close enough to watch but far enough to make it clear he was not helping. When I came out, he straightened up and looked at me with the particular expression that Vreth made when they were trying to appear neutral. "Your assessment," he said. "I will have it ready in 48 hours, I said. "The contract says 72. "I am aware. I will have it in 48. I picked up my tool case. "I need access to the cargo hold and the lower engineering section. Those areas are partially stripped. "I know. I need to see what is left." Sket was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are not going to tell me she is worthless." "No," I said. "I am not going to tell you that." "What are you going to tell me?" I looked back at the ship. From here I could see the curve of her hull, where the lights of the scrapyard reflected off the blackened plating, and despite all the damage, and all the years, and all the indignities of being stripped and assessed and poked at by people who did not understand her, she still looked like what she was. She still looked like a warship. "I am going to make you an offer," I said. "For the whole ship. Everything that is left. As is, where is, no conditions." Sket made the sound again. The Vreth laugh. "You are serious." "I am always serious about ships. She is unsalvageable. Then you should be happy to sell her to me cheap." He was quiet for a longer time this time. The laughter had gone. In its place was something more careful, more calculating. Vreth were good at calculating. It was one of the things their species genuinely excelled at. "We will discuss the price," he said finally. "Yes," I said, "we will." I turned and walked back toward the access hatch, and behind me, I could feel the ship in the dark, patient and cold and waiting, the way things that are not truly broken wait for someone who knows how to fix them. I had known, standing in that scrapyard looking at her from the outside, what I was going to do. I had known before I landed. I had known, if I am being completely honest, when I first read the decommission notice 11 months ago and recognized her hull number and pulled up her service record and read through what she had survived before they declared her too expensive to repair. What the Vreth thought they were selling me was a pile of expensive scrap. What they were actually selling me was a ship that was not finished yet. And I was very far from finished myself. The negotiation took 9 hours, which was fast by Vreth standards and agonizing by mine. Sket brought in 2 other senior syndicate members, a pair of Vreth I had not met before who spent the first 2 hours running their own scans of the ship with equipment considerably better than their field technicians had used. I let them scan. I sat outside the bay on a crate that had once held atmospheric processors and ate a ration bar and waited. They found more than their technicians had. They found the secondary weapons array. They found the backup navigation crystal. They spent a long time in the engineering section, and when they came back out, their expressions were carefully arranged into neutral, which was how I knew they had found the reactor's actual condition. The price went up. I expected that. But not as high as it could have gone, because even with what they found, they did not know what I knew. They found the systems. They did not understand the implications of those systems. They did not know that the supplemental diagnostic network had logged the ship's full condition at a level of detail that told me, with a high degree of certainty, what was repairable and what was not. They did not know about the backup power cells or how much capacity was left in them, or what that meant for the restart sequence I was already planning in my head. And they did not know about the manual. Chapter 11, Section 4. Emergency Cold Restart Procedures for Cascade Failed Antimatter Cores. My grandfather had written annotations in the margins of his copy. I had read those annotations so many times I could reproduce them from memory. The procedure had a success rate that the official literature called acceptable under field conditions, which was the UEF's way of saying it was the best option available in situations where all the better options were gone. We agreed on a price. I did not have the full amount in liquid credits. I had roughly 60% of it, which was the entirety of my savings after 11 years of working for the fleet, minus the cost of my passage to this scrapyard and the ration bars I had bought for the work ahead. I negotiated the remaining 40% as a deferred payment, using the ship herself as collateral, with Sket holding a senior lien that would expire in 18 months. He agreed because he believed the ship would never be worth more than she was right now, and in 18 months I would default, and he would get her back as pure scrap weight anyway. He was a very good calculator. He was calculating for the wrong outcome. I signed the transfer documents on a tablet that Sket produced from his thorax pack. The transfer was registered with the Keth Nebula Salvage Registry, which was the local authority for this section of space, and which maintained records that were recognized by the Galactic Commerce Tribunal. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. The Odyssey was mine. I went back inside, found the least damaged area of the crew quarters on Deck 2, unrolled my sleeping pad, and lay down in the cold and the dark. I was tired, in a way that had nothing to do with the day's work. It was the kind of tired that builds over years, not hours. The fleet had retired me with a letter that praised my service record and cited budget realignments, and thanked me for my contributions. I had read it 4 times trying to find a way to be angry at it instead of just empty, and I had never quite managed it. But lying there in the dark of that old ship, with the cold coming through the walls and the distant sounds of the scrapyard carrying through the hull, I felt something shift in me. Not hope exactly. Something more solid than hope. More like recognition. The Odyssey and I had both been declared finished. Both of us had been assessed and found too damaged to be worth the effort of repair. Both of us were going to prove that assessment wrong. I closed my eyes and started running the restart sequence in my head from the beginning, the way my grandfather had taught me to prepare for a difficult job. You do not sleep before a hard task. You plan. You work through every step until the planning itself becomes a kind of rest. I was still planning when I fell asleep. Outside, across the scrapyard, the lights of other dying ships blinked slowly in the dark. I found Glenn Archer on a mining platform 3 days out from the scrapyard, doing atmospheric seal work for a Keth extraction company that paid him in fuel credits, and did not ask too many questions about his former clearance level. He was under a crawlway panel when I found him, and the first thing he said to me when he heard my boots on the floor grating was, "Whatever you are selling, I am not buying." "I am not selling," I said. "I am building." He came out from under the panel and looked up at me. Glenn was tall and lean in the way of someone who had always been lean, and had gotten more so with hard years. He had worked as my secondary engineer on a deep-range survey mission 4 years ago, and before that he had spent 8 years in UEF fleet maintenance, and before that he had grown up on a repair station in the outer belt where you learned to fix things or you went without. His hands were always either working or about to be working. Even now, holding a sealing tool and looking at me with the flat expression of a man who had learned not to get excited about things, his fingers were already moving slightly, the way they did when he was thinking. "What are you building?" he said. "An Odyssey-class warship." He looked at me for a long moment. "They were all decommissioned." "Not all of them." Another moment. "Mara," he said. "Which one?" "7. He put down the sealing tool and stood up slowly. He was quiet for a time, that stretched long enough that I started wondering if I had read him wrong. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" That was Glenn. No 10 minutes of convincing. No list of objections. He had heard what I was doing and made his decision before I finished the sentence, because he was an engineer, and he knew what it meant, that one of those ships was still intact enough to rebuild, and he was not the kind of person who could hear that and say no. I needed him for the reactor work. I could plan the cold restart sequence from memory, and I could perform parts of it alone, but the critical phase, the manual resequencing of the magnetic bottle while the core pressurized, required 2 people. The procedure was written for 2 people. My grandfather's annotations specifically said, "Do not attempt alone." He had underlined it twice. Glenn came back to the scrapyard with me on the next transport. The second person I found was Claire Henning, and finding her took longer and was harder in a different way. Claire had been a weapons systems specialist with a clearance level that meant her personnel file had sections I was not allowed to read, even though I had worked alongside her for 3 years. She was precise and methodical, and she had a way of looking at a problem from every possible angle before she committed to a solution, which made her slow in casual conversation and invaluable in a crisis. She had left the fleet voluntarily, which surprised everyone who knew her, and she had spent the time since doing consulting work for a Thalari engineering firm that primarily built luxury atmospheric vessels. I found her contact through a mutual acquaintance and sent a message that said only, "Odyssey-class hull 7. Keth Scrapyard 9. I bought her. I need a weapons engineer." She sent back a message that said, "Secondary array intact." I replied. Yes. She sent, I will be there in 6 days. 6 days was faster than I had expected. She must have left within hours of my message. While I waited for both of them, I worked alone. There was more to do than I could usefully plan for, which was fine, because planning was not what that time was for. That time was for looking, for mapping, for understanding every centimeter of what I had and what I needed. I moved through the ship with my probe and my light and my field manuals, and I cataloged everything with the systematic patience that 11 years of doing difficult work in difficult places had given me. The collapsed sections were a problem. Decks 3 through 5 in the aft section were gone in the structural sense. The frames had buckled and the floor plating had dropped, and the whole section had compressed in a way that was not going to be reversed by any repair I could do with the resources available to me. I accepted this early and clearly, because one of the things that kills a rebuild faster than anything else is holding on to what is gone, instead of working with what remains. The forward hull was intact. Decks 1 and 2 were sound. Engineering was damaged but reachable. The core systems I needed were present. That was enough. I started making a list of what I needed from outside the ship. It was a long list. I was going to need conductors, superconducting filament, human grade if I could find it, which I probably could not, but close equivalent if I found the right alien alternatives. I was going to need power coupling components. I was going to need atmospheric processors for at least the working sections before we could take the suits off. I was going to need food and water for 3 people for a period I was not yet ready to estimate. I was going to need fabrication materials, not a fabrication machine, which would have been ideal, but was several levels above what I could afford, but raw materials I could shape by hand with the right tools. There was a Keth scrap dealer on the station level above the docking grid who went by the name Gorvesh, and who had sold me good parts at honest prices on my previous visit here. I went to see him on my second day. Gorvesh was a small Keth, which was unusual, since the Keth tended toward large. He had the gray-green scaled exterior of his species, and the 4-fingered hands, and the wide horizontal mouth that made every Keth look permanently skeptical, even when they were not being skeptical, which in Gorvesh's case was not that often anyway. He dealt in a rotating inventory of components from every species that passed through the yard, and he had an instinct for matching what people needed with what he had that was frankly better than most human traders I had dealt with. He looked at my list for a long time. Human spec superconducting filament, he read. You know what current inventory is here. Nothing human spec, I said. I know. Show me what you have that is closest. He brought out 3 different samples. The first was Vreth-made, and had the wrong resistance profile for what I needed. The second was from a species I did not recognize, and its datasheet was in a language my translator could only partially handle, but the resistance readings Gorvesh ran for me were close. The third was Thalari manufactured, standard grade, designed for their atmospheric vessel power routing, and when I ran the numbers on it, the resistance profile was actually better than human spec for my purposes, not because it was superior material, but because the specific resistance curve happened to match what the Odyssey's secondary systems needed, in a way that human spec would have slightly missed. I bought all 16 kilometers of the Thalari filament that Gorvesh had in stock. He gave me a look that I was beginning to recognize as the scrapyard equivalent of mild concern. What are you doing with all of this? He said. Rewiring something. Something large. Yes. He looked at me for a moment longer, then looked at his inventory screen, then looked back at me. I will tell you something, he said, because you pay promptly, and you do not argue about prices, which is a rare quality in this yard. He pulled up a secondary screen. There is a crashed survey drone being processed in Bay 63. The crew that brought it in does not know what the AI core is worth because they cannot read the spec markings. I can. It is an Aurora-class intelligence core, human manufacture. I have not listed it yet. An Aurora-class AI core was worth more than I had paid for the ship. What does the buyer's price look like? I said carefully. For you? Reasonable. Because the filament you just bought makes more sense if you have something that can use it correctly. I bought the AI core. I was now operating on a credit balance that would have made a more cautious person very uncomfortable. I had never been particularly cautious with money when it came to ships. I had learned this from my grandfather, who had once said that a person who worries more about the cost of fixing a thing than about the condition of the thing has already lost the argument with reality. Glenn arrived on day 4. I met him at the docking port with a cup of very bad coffee that was the best I could produce with what the ship's galley had left in it, and he drank it without complaint, which told me his time on the mining platform had been harder than his message had let on. "Show me the reactor," he said. I took him down to engineering. He stood in front of the core housing for a long time, running his own probe over it, reading the numbers, cross-referencing with his tablet. I let him work without interrupting. Glenn processed information the same way I did, sequentially, completely, without shortcuts, and interrupting him mid-assessment was the kind of thing that annoyed him in a way he never said directly, but that you could see in the set of his shoulders. Finally, he straightened up. "Chapter 11, Section 4, he said. "Yes. Your grandfather's procedure. It is not specifically his procedure. He used it. He documented it better than anyone else had." "How many times has it worked?" "Reliably documented successes across all known applications. 14. Attempted total. 35. Glenn was quiet for a moment. "You are telling me it fails more than half the time." "I am telling you the official success rate is 14 out of 35, and that 11 of the failures occurred because the engineer doing the manual resequence panicked during pressurization and aborted before the sequence completed, which caused the cascade failure it was designed to prevent. And 2 more failures were on cores that had actual physical damage to the bottle housing that made the procedure impossible. So the real success rate for correctly performed procedures on intact housings is 14 out of 22. Closer to 15 out of 22 if you count one attempt that was recorded as a failure because the restart required a second cycle before it stabilized." Glenn looked at the core housing again. He did the math in his head, the way he always did, quickly, and without showing the work. "The housing on this one looks intact." "It is intact. The diagnostic net confirmed it. Then we are running a procedure with a real-world success rate of approximately 68% on a reactor core that has been in cold shutdown for 11 years. "Yes." He picked up his coffee and drank the rest of it. "When does Claire get here?" 2 days. Then we have 2 days to prep the core and review the sequence." He handed me the empty cup. "We should get started." Claire arrived not in 2 days, but in 1.5, which was classic Claire. She had found a faster transit connection and had not bothered to tell me, because she figured I would just tell her it was unnecessary. She came aboard carrying 2 personal cases and a third case that I recognized as specialized equipment from the design of its lock, and she went directly to the weapons bay without stopping to look at anything else on the way. I found her there 20 minutes later, standing in front of the secondary array housing with her arms crossed and an expression on her face that I could not immediately read. "You knew about these," she said, when she heard me come in. "Yes. They are completely undamaged." "I know. The primary array is gone, all 12 emitters, completely fused, but these," she reached out and put her hand flat against the housing, in a gesture so similar to the one I had made standing in front of the ship from outside that I almost smiled. "These are perfect." "The housing is also blast rated to a higher standard than the official spec," I said. "I found the original build notes in the diagnostic logs. The engineer who installed these added supplemental plating that was not required. It was not in any of the drawings." Claire was quiet for a moment. "Someone really loved this ship," she said. "Yes," I said. "Someone really did." We worked for the next 11 days with the kind of focus that I had not felt in years, the kind that takes over your whole body so that you forget to be tired, or hungry, or anything other than completely present in the work. Glenn and I reviewed the restart sequence every evening for the first week, running through it step by step, until we could both perform each phase from memory and anticipate every decision point. Claire spent her first 3 days on a complete assessment of the secondary array and the weapons control systems, and what she found was better than my initial read had suggested. Not only were the emitters intact, but the targeting architecture connected to them, the processing network that handled aim, range calculation, and fire coordination, had been protected by the same blast shielding as the emitters themselves, and was largely functional. The scrapyard around us continued its business without much concern for ours. Vreth crews stripped ships in the adjacent bays. Keth haulers moved material on the loading rails above us. Occasionally, someone would drift close enough to look at what we were doing, and then move on. not understanding enough of it to know what to make of it. Gorvesh came by once, on day 8, with a crate he said he had set aside. Inside were 12 power coupling components that were human specification, pulled from a ship that had come in too recently to have been fully logged into inventory. He named a price that was fair, and I paid it without negotiating, and he left with the same expression he always wore, which told me nothing about what he was thinking. On day 9, I started the atmospheric processor installation. The ship was currently survivable only in suits, which was a significant limitation on the kind of detailed work we needed to do in certain sections. Getting even partial life support running was going to require bypassing the primary life support control system entirely and running a manual loop through the backup environmental network, which existed and was functional, but had never been designed to run without the primary system's supervision. This was the kind of problem that required exactly the mindset my grandfather had tried to teach me, and that I had spent years practicing. Not the mindset of solving the problem you were designed to solve, but the mindset of solving the problem you were actually facing, with the tools you actually had. The backup environmental network could not run without the primary system's control signals, but it could run without the primary system if I provided substitute signals from a different source. The Aurora-class AI core that Gorvesh had found for me was designed to manage complex multivariable systems. With the right configuration, it could generate the control signals the backup environmental network needed. It took 2 full days of work to make that connection. When it was done, Glenn ran the atmospheric test from the secondary power junction, while Claire and I stood in the corridor outside the engineering section in our suits, watching the pressure gauge on the door. The needle moved, slowly, then steadily. It took 4 hours to fully pressurize one deck. When the gauge read safe, Claire reached up and unsealed her helmet and breathed in the recycled, processed, not particularly pleasant air of a ship that was slowly waking up, and she said, "There she is." Glenn's voice came over the suit comm from engineering. "Atmospheric stable. Temperature is 9 degrees. Not comfortable, but breathable." 9 degrees is fine, I said. I unsealed my own helmet. It was very cold. It smelled like metal and old dust, and the particular dry, slightly electric smell of machinery that had been sitting for a long time. It was the best air I had breathed in months. We were ready for the reactor. The morning of the restart attempt, Glenn made breakfast. He had found the ship's emergency food cache, sealed behind a panel in the crew quarters, that the Vreth had missed because it was labeled in human script as a secondary atmospheric regulator housing. Inside were enough ration packs for 40 people for 30 days. Glenn heated 3 of them on a field unit and brought them to the engineering level, and we ate in silence with the reactor housing visible from where we sat. None of us talked about the procedure. We had talked about it enough. Everything that could be said about it had been said, every contingency reviewed, every decision point discussed until there was nothing left to discuss. Talking about it more at this point would not have made us more prepared. It would only have made us more aware of the many ways it could end badly. We suited back up after eating, because the procedure required suit protection regardless of atmospheric status. The magnetic bottle resequencing phase produced radiation levels that were manageable behind a suit, but not behind clothing. My grandfather's annotations on that page were particularly emphatic. Full suit, no exceptions. He had written this in a heavier hand than the rest of his notes, which meant he had felt strongly enough about it to press harder on the pen. I went in first. The containment ring was a 3-meter-wide circular structure at the heart of the engineering section, surrounding the reactor core like a collar. It had been designed to be accessed for maintenance purposes, with a sealed entry port on the lower ring segment and handholds positioned at calculated intervals for the engineer doing the work. I had measured the handholds and confirmed they matched the positions described in the field manual. I had measured the interior diameter and confirmed it matched. I had run a probe scan of the interior to confirm no unexpected damage. There is a moment, before you start a procedure you have only ever read about, where all the preparation you have done collides with the reality of doing it, and the difference between the two becomes briefly, viscerally real. I had that moment crawling through the entry port into the interior of the containment ring. The walls of the ring were close. The core housing was directly in front of me, 2 meters away, behind its shielding. The control interface I needed was at the 8 o'clock position from the entry port, which I had known from the diagrams but which was still a slightly awkward reach from where I was positioned. I found the interface. I put my hands on it. "Glenn," I said. "Ready," Glenn said. He was at the external control junction, which was the position that managed the power cell draw for the restart sequence and the emergency abort trigger. "Claire." "Ready," Claire said. She was at the secondary systems panel, managing the power routing that would feed into the reactor once it was live. "Beginning sequence," I said. "Step 1. Step 1 was a diagnostic confirmation, running the resequence initiation check through the interface to confirm that the core housing interior was in the condition the procedure required. The interface was cold, and the controls were stiff, from 11 years of disuse, but they moved. The diagnostic ran. The result came back on the small screen set into the interface panel, all parameters within range. "Diagnostic confirmed," I said, moving to Step 2. Step 2 was the initiation of the magnetic bottle realignment, which was the reason a person had to be inside the ring. The realignment required manual adjustment of the field generator nodes at 4 specific points around the ring's interior, in a sequence and at a pace that was too precise for the automated systems to manage when starting from a completely cold state. The automated systems had been designed to assume a warm core, a core that had some residual function, some baseline field to adjust from. Starting from 0 required hands on the nodes, making the adjustments by feel as much as by instrument, responding to the field's behavior in real time. I moved to the first node. The field generator was a physical device, roughly the size and shape of a thick disc, set flush into the ring wall, with a manual adjustment collar around its rim. I put both hands on the collar and began to turn it by the specified amount, watching the indicator needle on the small gauge above it. The needle moved. Good. The mechanism was not frozen. I moved to the second node. Same process. Same result. The third node required more force. I felt resistance in the collar that I had not felt in the first two, and for a bad moment, I thought it might be seized. I applied steady, even pressure, the way the manual said to, without jerking or forcing, and after 3 seconds, that felt considerably longer. The collar gave, and the needle moved. The fourth node. "Mara," Glenn said. "Power cells are drawing." "I hear it." I could feel it, actually. The faintest vibration in the ring, coming up through the handholds, coming through the soles of my boots. Something was starting to happen inside the core. Something was beginning to wake. On the fourth node now. "Field strength on the primary sensor is moving," Claire said. "Slow. Coming up." The fourth node's collar was smooth. It adjusted precisely, and when the needle on its gauge settled at the required position, I felt a shift in the vibration beneath my hands, a change in quality. Not louder, not stronger, but different in a way that my body understood before my mind put words to it. "Node 4 set," I said. "Beginning pressurization phase." This was the part that failed most often. The pressurization was automatic once the nodes were correctly set. The system took over and began building the magnetic field to operational pressure in a sequence that no human hand was fast enough to manage directly. The engineer's job during pressurization was to monitor the field behavior and intervene only if a specific set of deviation readings appeared. If they appeared, the intervention window was approximately 4 seconds. If the intervention failed, the abort had to be triggered in the next 2 seconds, or the cascade began. My grandfather's note for this section read, "The field will sound wrong before the instruments show it. Trust what you hear." He had never explained exactly what he meant by that. I had never been in a situation before where I could find out. I listened. The vibration in the ring changed as the pressurization built. It became rhythmic in a way that was not exactly sound, but was not exactly not sound either. A cycling, pulsing quality that I felt in my chest, as much as heard with my ears. It was strange and slightly unsettling, and entirely unlike anything I had experienced in the normal operation of reactors I had worked with before, because normal reactors came online from warm states and made normal operational sounds. This was something being built from nothing. This was a machine arguing itself back into existence. "Field at 40%, Claire said, holding curve. 60, she said, 30 seconds later. I kept listening. The cycling quality of the vibration was steady. It was not building toward anything that felt wrong. The tempo was consistent. The depth of it was consistent. It did not sound, feel, like the descriptions of cascade onset that I had read in every failure report I had been able to find before we started. 75%. The vibration increased, not in a way that suggested instability, in a way that suggested momentum, something gathering itself. 85. I was watching the deviation gauge on the interior panel. The needle had not moved from its center position. I had my hand 3 centimeters from the intervention control, not touching it, close enough to reach it in the time available if I needed to. 90, Glenn said. Power draw is spiking. Expected range. Confirmed, Claire said. 95. The sound, the feeling, changed. My whole body registered it before my mind did. The cycling quality shifted, deepened, and then settled into something that was no longer cycling at all. It became continuous, smooth. A single long note that was felt rather than heard, rising in frequency as I stood there, coming up from nothing, and going up and up and up, until it was there, fully present. The sound of something that was alive again. 100%, Claire said. Her voice was completely flat and controlled, but I had worked with her long enough to hear the thing underneath the flatness. Field stable, core online, reactor is running. I held onto the node housing for a moment because my hands needed something to hold. Glenn said, Mara, she is running. Yes, I said. My voice sounded very calm. I did not feel calm. I felt something that did not have a simple name. Yes, she is. I came back out through the entry port and stood up in engineering, and the ship around me was different in a way that was not visible or measurable, but was unmistakably real. The vibration was in the floor now, the walls. The hum that filled the air was low and steady and very deep, and it was the sound that every human ship I had ever been on made when it was fully powered, and it was the sound of a machine being exactly what it was designed to be. Glenn was grinning. He did not do that often. Claire had turned back to her panel and was already working, because that was how Claire responded to things. But I could see the set of her shoulders, and it was different from how it had been 10 minutes ago. Weapons system power connection is ready, she said. Ready to route on your word. Route it. The lights came on. Not everywhere, only in the sections where I had confirmed the lighting systems were intact, but the sections that came alive blazed with the particular cool white light of full power availability, and the difference between that light and the portable lights we had been working by for weeks was the difference between a candle and a window. Everything looked different. The ship looked different. She looked like herself. Over the next 4 days, with full reactor power available, the pace of the work changed completely. Systems that had been dark because there was not enough backup power to run them came online one by one as I routed power through the secondary network. The Aurora-class AI core came fully active for the first time, completing its initialization sequence in 40 minutes, and then immediately beginning to integrate with the ship's systems. Claire named it Lena. I did not ask her why. Some things do not need explaining. Lena was thorough. She began her own assessment of the ship's condition simultaneously with the work we were doing, mapping systems faster and more completely than I had managed in weeks. She found things I had missed. Not many, because I had been thorough, but a few. A sealed cache of repair components in the hull structure, placed there by the original engineering crew as a long-duration maintenance reserve. A communications relay that was operational, but had been in passive mode, silently listening to the scrapyard traffic for 11 years and logging everything. A set of emergency thruster systems in the lower hull that were separate from the main drive and were fully functional. She also found the combat logs. The Odyssey had been in 3 separate engagements in the 2 years before her decommission. The logs covered all 3. I read them with the same feeling I had when I first stood in the bridge, the feeling of understanding something about this ship that her outside told you nothing about. She had been hit many times in those engagements. She had kept fighting each time. The decisions recorded in the logs, the tactical choices, the route adjustments, the damage control sequences, showed a crew and a captain who knew exactly what their ship could take and pushed as close to that limit as they had to. The 3rd engagement was the one that ended her. The logs showed what had happened. A weapon hit on the upper aft section that had done exactly the kind of damage she was showing now. The captain had made the decision to execute the controlled hull bleed to save the core. The decision had worked. They had brought her home. And then the fleet's accountants had looked at the repair cost and made a different decision. I closed the logs. I did not read them again. The scrapyard crews in adjacent bays had started to notice. It was impossible not to. A reactor coming online made itself known. The sensors of every ship in range would have registered it. We began receiving visitors, not Sket, who had not come near us since the sale was completed, but other crews, other scavengers, curious faces at the bay entrance watching us work. Some of them were Keth, some were Vreth. A few were species I could not immediately identify. None of them came in. I did not invite them. Gorvesh stopped by once, looked at the lights, looked at Claire working at the weapons panel, and made a sound that I thought was the Keth equivalent of impressed, before he left without saying anything. On day 14 of the full rebuild, Claire came to find me in the bridge where I was working on the navigation systems. "I need to show you something," she said. I followed her to the weapons bay. She had the secondary array interface fully active, all 12 emitters displayed on her board, all 12 reading green. She had spent the previous week bringing the targeting system up and calibrating it, and she had been characteristically quiet about the results until she was sure. "The emitters are at full function," she said. "The targeting network is integrated. Lena is running fire control coordination." She paused. "There is something else." She pulled up a schematic on the secondary display. It was a section of the hull I had catalogued as ventilation routing. "This is not ventilation," she said. "The Vreth stripped the primary array. What they did not know, what is not on any schematic I have ever seen, is that the primary array had a connection point here, and here." She pointed to 2 locations. "And the secondary array has output nodes that match those points. The original engineers designed them to be connected, not to run separately. Running them connected, with full reactor power, changes the output profile significantly." I looked at the schematic. I understood what she was showing me. How significantly? She told me the numbers. I was quiet for a moment. "The Vreth thought they were stripping the weapons system," I said. "They stripped the primary emitters," Claire said. "The primary emitters were the trigger. The secondary array is the actual weapon. It was designed to look like a backup system. It was never a backup system. It was the main event, and the primary array was the decoy." Someone who had built this ship had anticipated exactly what happened: a boarding, a stripping, an attempt to render it harmless, and had designed for that too. Had hidden the real capability behind the obvious one. Had trusted that a human engineer, given enough time and the right field manuals, would find it. I sat down in the chair at the weapons station. I looked at Claire. "Can you make the connection?" "I have already made it," she said. "I wanted you to understand what it was before I activated it." "Activate it." She entered the command. The board changed. The output readings climbed to a number that was very different from what they had been, and I looked at those numbers and understood that the Odyssey was no longer what the Vreth thought they had sold me, and was no longer what I had thought I had bought, and was something that neither of us had fully understood she was until this moment. She was extraordinary. The Vreth Enforcer crew arrived on day 17, and they did not come quietly. There were 8 of them, in a sealed transit pod that docked at our bay entrance without requesting permission. They came in wearing armor, light, functional Vreth combat plating, and the leader, a broad-built Vreth who was considerably larger than Sket, and moved with the particular unhurried confidence of someone who had done this many times before, walked to the center of the bay and looked around at what we had built, and let the silence stretch long enough to make clear that he considered the silence his to control. His name, when he eventually introduced himself, was Herrick. He was a syndicate enforcement officer. He had a document in a flat case under one limb that he placed on a workbench without looking away from me. "Open it," he said. I opened it. It was a legal filing, a Keth Nebula salvage registry challenge to my purchase, filed on the grounds that the ship's restored condition represented an increase in value that had not been reflected in the sale price, and that therefore the transaction had been conducted under materially false pretenses. It was, legally, thin, very thin. But legal proceedings in the Keth Nebula took time, and time was the resource that Herrick and the Vreth Syndicate were actually purchasing with this filing. Time in which my deferred payment to Sket would continue accumulating. Time in which my work permit on the station could be challenged. Time in which operating a powered vessel in a scrapyard without a current flight license, a license I did not yet have because the ship was not yet re-registered, could become a formal violation. I set the document down. I looked at Herrick. He looked back at me with the patient expression of someone who was very used to this moment, the moment when the person on the other side understood what they were facing and began calculating whether to fight or concede. "I want to show you something," I said. I walked to the secondary systems panel. Glenn was at the engineering station, and Claire was at the weapons board, and Lena was managing power distribution, and all three of them were watching me with the kind of careful attention that meant they were ready for whatever came next. I brought up the full ship status display, the reactor output, the weapons system readings, the atmospheric status, the navigation system, which was not yet flight-ready but was partially functional, the structural integrity map, all of it, simultaneously, displayed on the main board in the clear, detailed, unmistakable language of a ship that was not only alive but capable. Herrick looked at the display. His expression did not change. "The legal challenge," I said, "rests on the argument that I obtained this ship at a price that did not reflect its restored value. It will take your syndicate's legal team approximately 4 months to make that case before the Keth Tribunal, assuming they file this week. In those 4 months, I will have this ship re-registered with the United Earth Fleet Auxiliary Registry, which supersedes Keth Nebula jurisdiction for vessels of human manufacture. At that point, the challenge becomes a matter for the Galactic Commerce Tribunal, which has a 4 to 7 year backlog." I paused. "Alternatively, I can offer you something faster." Herrick's compound eyes did not change, but I had been dealing with Vreth long enough to read the posture shift. "Speak," he said. "The Aurora-class AI core I installed, Lena, has spent the last 8 days running passive sensors through the hull. This is a scrapyard. The passive sensors on this ship are considerably more capable than anything currently operating in this section of space." I pulled up a secondary display. "Lena has identified, cataloged, and logged the locations and contents of 43 unsalvaged component caches distributed through ships in adjacent bays that your own teams have not found. She has also identified 2 ships in this yard that are incorrectly logged in the registry, ships that were brought in under fraudulent manifests to hide their actual origin." I looked at Herrick. "I will give you the component cache data, and I will not mention the fraudulent manifests to the registry, unless the challenge filing is withdrawn, and the lien is restructured to standard commercial terms." Another pause. Longer this time. "The value of those caches," Herrick said. "Gorvesh estimated approximately 14 times the current disputed sale price." Herrick was quiet for a long time. I had learned, over years, not to fill silences like this with more words. The silence was doing work. Filling it would be conceding something. Finally, Herrick picked up the document case from the workbench. "We will review your offer," he said. They left. Glenn exhaled slowly from the engineering station. "That was either very smart or very dangerous," he said. "It was both," Claire said without looking up from her board. "The component caches are real?" Glenn said. "Completely real," I said. "Lena found them. We do not need them. The Vreth do." The calculation was straightforward. "What about the fraudulent manifests?" "Also real. 2 ships. I do not actually want to report them to the registry, because the ships themselves are not a problem for us, and creating enemies in this yard for the sake of being thorough is not useful." I sat down at the navigation station. "But Herrick does not know I do not want to report them." Glenn shook his head slowly. 11 years in the fleet, and I never once saw you negotiate like that." "In the fleet, I did not have to negotiate. I had a rank and a clearance badge." I pulled up the navigation diagnostic I had been working on before the Enforcer crew arrived. "Out here, I have a ship and an AI core and a very good passive sensor array." The challenge filing was withdrawn 4 days later. The lien restructuring documents arrived the following day. Sket signed them without comment. I had Gorvesh witness the new terms and register them with the Keth Authority, which cost a small fee and was worth every fraction of it. We went back to work. The next phase was the one I had been planning the longest and thinking about with the most complicated feelings, because it was the phase where we stopped repairing what the Odyssey had been and started making her into something she had never been. Let me be clear about this. The repairs, The reactor restart, the weapons system restoration, the atmospheric systems, the navigation rebuild. All of that was returning the ship to her original specification. That was restoration. What came next was not restoration. What came next was me spending 3 weeks in a junkyard, surrounded by alien technology, and doing the thing that my species has done since the first of us picked up a stone and realized it could be a tool, taking what was available and making it into something more than what it started as. The Vreth point defense system we pulled from a partially stripped cruiser in Bay 38. The cruiser had been abandoned mid-process by a team that had taken the components they needed and left the rest. The point defense array was intact, still in its mounting frame, still connected to a small backup power cell that kept its onboard systems in standby. Vreth point defense worked beautifully within its design parameters. Fast acquisition, precise tracking, elegant firing arcs. It was built for Vreth ships, which were generally faster and lighter than human vessels, and its calibration reflected that. I did not need it to defend a Vreth ship. Claire and I spent 4 days rewiring the acquisition system to operate at the sensor speed that the Odyssey's existing detection network could sustain, which was not the same speed the Vreth system expected but was faster in a different way. It covered a wider arc with less resolution per target, which was appropriate for the Odyssey's role as a ship that expected to be attacked from multiple vectors simultaneously. The tracking was recalibrated for human-scale maneuver profiles. The firing cycle was accelerated by removing the safety delay that Vreth systems used, which existed because Vreth ships could not absorb the recoil of a faster cycle rate. The Odyssey could. Glenn found the gravitational lens array in Bay 51. He came to find me the morning after he discovered it, carrying a data chip with his scan results, and the expression on his face was the one he got when he had found something that he did not know quite what to do with. "It is a Keth mining tool," he said. "I know what it is. They use it to reshape asteroid surfaces. The gravitational distortion field it generates is," he looked at his data chip, "very significant in the near-field range." "I know. Mara, what are you planning to do with a Keth asteroid mining tool?" "What do you do when you cannot dodge an incoming projectile?" I said. He thought about it. "You change where the projectile thinks you are." "Yes, I took the data chip from him. Or you change where gravity is." The gravitational lens array took 11 days to install and integrate. It was designed for a Keth mining platform that had specific mass and structural characteristics, and the Odyssey's characteristics were different in ways that required creative engineering at almost every integration point. Glenn found 3 separate occasions during the process where the adapter work I had designed was not going to hold under operational stress, and he redesigned each one with the quiet competence that was his primary professional gift. Not dramatic, not revolutionary, just exactly right. The final installation was something neither the Keth who built the original array, nor the human engineers who designed the Odyssey would have recognized, but it worked, and Lena confirmed it would hold. The Thalari energy diffusion mesh came from a luxury vessel that had arrived in the yard during our 3rd week of modifications. The vessel was enormous and obscenely well appointed, and had been damaged in a debris field incident that was apparently very embarrassing for its owner, who had arranged to have it quietly processed here rather than at a more visible repair facility. The energy mesh was a heat management system, covering the outer hull in a layer of material that absorbed thermal energy and distributed it evenly to prevent hotspots. On a pleasure yacht, this meant nobody's cabin got too warm. I had a different application in mind. Lena modeled it first. I fed her the mesh's technical specifications and asked her to calculate what would happen if the material were overloaded to its maximum absorption threshold and then discharged in a controlled directional burst, rather than allowed to distribute evenly. She ran the calculation 3 times, because the result the first time seemed too large to be correct, and the second and third calculations confirmed the first. "This would function as a directed energy pulse," Lena said through the ship's newly restored intercom. Her voice was calm and precise, and had the particular quality of an AI that was genuinely interested in what it was working on. "The discharge would be substantial. I recommend we label this capability with a designation." "Why?" I said. "Because it will be useful to be able to refer to it quickly in operational conditions." I thought about it. "Call it a pulse discharge." "I would suggest something more specific," Lena said. "The discharge profile is unusual. It would assist in communication if it had a distinct name." Glenn, who was at the engineering station running power distribution calculations, said without looking up, "Call it after yourself, Mara. You designed it." I told him that was not necessary. Claire agreed with Glenn and said it absolutely was necessary. Lena sided with Claire on the grounds that operational terminology should be memorable and specific. The mesh discharge capability was subsequently logged in the ship's systems as the Voss Pulse. I noted this in my engineering log and did not mention it again. The final modification of this phase was the one that took the most time and that I felt the most complex about. The Odyssey had originally been designed with a specific structural identity, particular capacities, particular limits, particular design compromises that reflected the knowledge and resources available when she was built. Everything we had added expanded her capabilities, but it also changed what she was, in ways that went beyond engineering. I spent an evening sitting in the bridge with the lights on and the reactor humming below me, looking at the status board where every system showed green or amber, and I thought about the engineers who had built this ship, and the crew that had fought her, and the captain who had made the decision to save the core at the cost of the hull, and then brought her home. I thought about what they would think of what I had done to their ship. I decided they would approve, not because they would have made the same choices, but because every choice I had made was aimed at the same thing they had been aimed at, keeping her alive and making her capable of doing what she needed to do. The soul of the ship was not in any specific component or system. It was in the intent to survive, the intent to fight, the intent to come home. I had not changed that intent. I had expanded its means. The day we completed the modifications, Claire ran a full weapons system integration test. All 12 secondary emitters fired in coordinated sequence. The targeting network managed the timing with the precision that Lena's fire coordination provided, and the output readings on the board were exactly what they should be. The gravitational lens cycled through its operational modes without fault. The point defense array swept its full coverage arc and found targets in the calibration test with the improved acquisition speed we had designed for. The pulse discharge system, the Voss Pulse, ran through a half-power test cycle that made the lights in the bay flicker and caused 3 Vreth crews in adjacent bays to scramble their own power systems in alarm. Glenn ran the propulsion diagnostics. The main drive was not at full original capacity. We had been unable to fully rebuild the aft propulsion section, given the collapsed deck damage, but it was at 81%, which was enough. The emergency thrusters Lena had found in the lower hull added a lateral maneuvering capability that the original design had not included. We were not finished. There was work still to do, systems to refine, components to replace and recalibrate. A ship like this is never truly finished in the same way that a house you live in is never truly finished. There is always something to improve. But she could fly, she could fight, she could take a hit and keep going. She was ready for what was coming. The Vreth interdiction fleet dropped out of transit at approximately 40 kilometers on our port side, and they were not quiet about it. 5 ships, a Claw-class lead vessel flanked by 4 escort-grade support ships, all of them military standard Vreth design, which meant they were fast, precisely built, and crewed by professionals who did their work without theatrics. They had come in at a transit angle that put them between us and the nearest relay beacon, which was the approach you used when you wanted someone to know they could not call for help before you decided whether they should be allowed to. We had left the scrapyard 4 days earlier. The re-registration process with the UEF Auxiliary Registry had taken less time than I expected. The Auxiliary Registry had an expedited process for restored vessels that I had not known about, and Lena had found it in the regulatory documentation while I was focused on systems work, which was exactly the kind of thing she was good at. Our registration was confirmed. We had a legal flight status. We were en route to the nearest UEF-affiliated transit station to complete the formal reinstatement process and file the full restoration documentation. We were not doing anything wrong. The Vreth fleet did not care about that. The lead vessel opened a channel. The officer on the line identified himself as Fleet Commander Dravek, which was a high enough rank that it told me this operation had been authorized at a significant level within the syndicate. He spoke in common, with an accent that was perfectly clear and had the precise clipped quality of someone who communicated for professional effect, rather than to express anything personal. He said we had 40 minutes to cut power, drop shields, and prepare for boarding. He said the matter of the disputed salvage claim had been reactivated under emergency commercial tribunal provisions, which was a legal mechanism that existed and which the Vreth used regularly because they had a great deal of influence with the commercial tribunal. He said resistance would be construed as hostile intent. He did not say what would happen if we resisted. He did not need to. The 5 ships said it for him. I was in the command chair. Glenn was at the engineering station. Claire was at the weapons board. Lena was everywhere simultaneously, the way a properly integrated AI core is everywhere. Her attention distributed across every system on the ship with an efficiency that 3 human engineers working in parallel could not have matched. 40 minutes, Glenn said. Not a question. A statement for the room. 40 minutes, I confirmed. What are we doing? Claire said. I leaned back in the command chair and looked at the tactical display where Lena had already mapped all 5 ships, their approach vectors, their projected firing arcs, and several dozen data points about their operational specifications that she had pulled from the passive sensor logs she had been keeping since we left the scrapyard. We are going to talk, I said, for as long as we can. And then we are going to demonstrate something. I opened the channel back to Dravik. What followed was the most productive 47 minutes of conversation I have had in my professional career, and I do not mean that entirely as a joke. I raised the question of the emergency commercial tribunal provision and its specific applicability to vessels registered in the UEF Auxiliary Registry, which it did not cover as a matter of fact. A detail buried in the treaty language between the UEF and the Keth Nebula Commercial Authority that I had read 3 times during our transit because I had expected something like this. Dravik's legal officer came on the channel to dispute this, and I cited the specific treaty article and section, which caused a pause while they verified it. While they verified it, Glenn was running the drive to full power, not engaging, just warming, getting the response times down, the systems hot, the ship ready. Dravik came back on the line. His tone had shifted slightly. Not dramatically, just the small shift of someone who has been told that one of their tools has a crack in it. He changed arguments. The new argument was that the restoration work had used components taken from syndicate inventory, the argument Herrick had raised and withdrawn at the scrapyard. I responded that all component sourcing was documented and that none of the components had been taken from syndicate inventory. They had been purchased through commercial channels, and I had receipts. Gorvesh had insisted on proper receipts for everything. I had thought at the time that this was excessive. I now thought that Gorvesh was wiser than he appeared. Lena flagged a tactical development. 2 of the escort ships had repositioned, closing the angle on our port side to limit our maneuvering options in that direction. This was being done slowly and without obvious intent, the way professionals do these things. If I had not had Lena mapping their vectors continuously, I might not have noticed in time. Tell me when they close to 30 kilometers on the port side, I told Lena quietly. They will reach that distance in approximately 9 minutes at current rate, Lena said. I kept talking to Dravik. I asked about the process for having the emergency tribunal provision reviewed for treaty compliance. I asked about the syndicate's interest in a negotiated resolution. I asked, with as much professional courtesy as I could put into my voice, whether Commander Dravik himself had the authority to negotiate such a resolution, or whether that required escalation to his superiors. This last question was the right question to ask a Vreth fleet commander. Questioning a Vreth officer's authority, however politely and hypothetically, was the kind of thing that required a response, and the response required time. 30 kilometers, Lena said. Portside escort ships. Drive ready? I said to Glenn. Ready. Claire? Ready, she said. Emitters are hot. Targeting is live. Point defense is tracking all 5 contacts. I spoke into the channel. Commander Dravik, I want to be very clear that my intention here is to find a resolution that works for both parties. But I also want to be clear about the nature of the situation you are currently in. Dravik said, I believe I understand the situation clearly. With respect, I am not certain you do. I brought up the tactical display on the main board. You have 5 ships, we have 1. On the basis of those numbers alone, you believe this is a simple operation. I would like to offer you some additional information before you commit to that assessment. A pause. Go ahead. My ship is a UES Odyssey-class warship, Hull 7, currently operating at modified specification. Our reactor output is at full operational level. Our weapon systems are active. Our targeting network is integrated with an Aurora-class AI core that has been tracking your fleet's movements, power emissions, and thruster output since you came out of transit. I looked at Claire. She gave me a single nod. Everything was where it needed to be. In the last 14 minutes, while we have been talking, your portside escorts have repositioned. I know this because we have been watching. In the last 9 minutes, your lead vessel has been cycling its weapon systems through a pre-fire warm-up sequence. I know this because our passive sensors resolved your power draw profile, and Lena identified the pattern. A longer pause. When Dravik came back, his voice had a quality in it that had not been there before. You are claiming combat readiness on a single restored vessel. I am not claiming anything. I am stating observable facts. I pulled up the weapons board readings on the main display, so they were visible from every station on the bridge. The Vreth Syndicate will be aware that Odyssey-class ships carry a secondary weapons architecture that was not removed during decommission. You may or may not be aware that this specific ship's secondary array was installed by engineers who connected it in a non-standard configuration that significantly alters its output profile. I will spare you the technical details, but our weapons specialist's assessment is that we can disable 4 of your 5 ships before your fleet reaches an optimal firing position. This was an overstatement. Claire had said 3 with confidence and 4 as a possibility. I had rounded up because the difference between 3 and 4 mattered psychologically, and because I was, in the deepest sense, bluffing with real cards. Dravik said, "You would not survive the return fire from the remaining vessel." Possibly not. That is a risk I am willing to accept. The question is whether the Vreth Syndicate considers this outcome a good commercial decision. 3 to 4 disabled fleet vessels, in exchange for 1 restored warship that you do not, legally, have a valid claim to. A very long pause this time. In the silence, Claire said quietly without moving from her board, "Lead vessel has stopped cycling weapons." I waited. Dravik said, "What is your counterproposal?" And there it was, the shift, not retreat. They were not retreating, they were recalculating, which is what intelligent opponents do when the numbers change. The numbers had changed because the numbers had always been different from what they thought, and now they knew it. "I do not have a counterproposal," I said. "I have a request. Let me pass. Let the registration process complete. When the Galactic Commerce Tribunal processes the Syndicate's claim, which is their right to file, I will participate in good faith. But I will not stand down this ship, and I will not accept boarding, and I will not pretend that the legal mechanism you are using gives you the authority it would need to have to justify this action." Another pause, shorter. "You are confident," Dravik said. "I am prepared," I said. "There is a difference." What happened next lasted 7 minutes and 42 seconds, according to the ship's log, and Lena's record of it is precise, down to fractions of a second for every event, which is the advantage of having a proper AI core managing your tactical systems. I will not walk through every moment of it. What I will say is that Dravik chose to test the situation, which was the decision a professional does make when the opponent might be bluffing, and the test confirmed that we were not. The portside escort moved to intercept. We moved with the main drive at a power level that Dravik's fleet had not planned for. The 81% capacity we had was still enough to surprise a fleet that had been briefed on the Odyssey's original decommissioned performance. The escort fired. We were not where it expected us to be, partly because of the drive speed and partly because the gravitational lens array produced a field distortion that made our position slightly ambiguous on standard targeting sensors. The shots missed. Not by much. But miss is miss. We did not fire back. Instead, the Voss pulse discharged at 30% power in a forward cone covering the lead vessel and both portside escorts. At 30%, it was not a weapon in the destructive sense. It was a system disruption. It hit everything electronic in its range with a pulse that required a system reset to recover from. Ships can recover from a system reset. It takes between 4 and 12 minutes depending on the design, during which the affected ships are dark and non-functional. The lead vessel and both port escorts went dark. Claire targeted the remaining 2 ships with the secondary emitters and held. Not fired. Held. The targeting locks were visible on their sensors. They knew we had them. "Your move," I said to the channel, which was still open, still carrying Dravik's transmission from the lead vessel, even though that vessel was in the process of resetting its systems, and Dravik himself had approximately 8 minutes of darkness ahead of him. One of the remaining escorts responded. The officer on the line was not Dravik. Dravik was currently sitting in a dark ship, but he had sufficient authority to make the decision that needed making. "Stand by," he said. We stood by. When Dravik came back online, his voice was different. Still professional, still controlled, but different in the specific way of a person who has just had an experience that has updated their model of what they thought they were dealing with. "I will recommend to the syndicate," he said, "that the commercial claim be submitted through standard tribunal channels. That is all I have asked for," I said. "This vessel will be watched," he said. "You understand this?" "I understand it. I hope they find the watching educational." The fleet did not follow us. We continued on our transit course, and behind us, the 3 ships that were coming back online did so slowly and without making any aggressive moves, and the 2 that had not been hit kept their distance and their weapons quiet. Glenn said, "Next time you tell me a plan has 2 possible outcomes, I am going to ask you to be more specific about which one you are actually counting on." "It worked," I said. "It worked," he agreed. "I would still like more specificity in the future." Claire was running the post-engagement diagnostic on the weapons board. Her expression was focused and professional, and underneath it was the same thing that was underneath all of our expressions right now, the particular sharp clarity that comes after something goes right, that could have gone very wrong. "Point defense performed above calibration spec," she said. "The pulse discharge ran cleaner than the test cycle. Emitters held at full output without thermal drift." She paused. She held. "Yes," I said, "she did." The tactical display showed clear space ahead. The relay beacon was 40 minutes away. Beyond it, the transit lane that would take us to the UEF-affiliated station, and the formal process of giving this ship her life back in full. I was very tired, and very awake at the same time, which is the state you end up in after an engagement, when everything in your body has been fully deployed, and is now slowly standing down. My hands were steady. My thinking was clear. The tiredness was clean, the kind that comes from having done something hard and done it well. Lena said, through the intercom, in her precise and calm voice, "The passive sensors have logged the complete engagement record. All ship behavior, power signatures, and tactical decisions are fully documented." "Good," I said. "I also want to note," Lena said, "that the Vreth fleet's passive sensors will have collected the same data from our side. Our capabilities are now known to the syndicate." "Good," I said again. Glenn looked at me. "Good?" "They needed to know," I said. "That is why I told Dravik everything I told him before any shot was fired. A capability that is secret is only useful once. A capability that is known changes calculations before anyone fires anything. I would rather not fire anything. You fired the pulse, after they fired at us, and I fired it at 30%. I looked at the display. I wanted witnesses, Glenn. I wanted a fleet commander who could go back and write a report. I wanted the syndicate to know exactly what this ship is, and what we are willing to do with her." I paused. "The next time someone thinks about sending 5 ships after us, they are going to read that report first." Glenn was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 14 out of 22. I looked at him. "The reactor restart," he said. "You told me the real success rate was 14 out of 22. I have been thinking about that number. What about it?" "It means 8 times it did not work. 8 times, the person doing the procedure stood in that ring and did everything right, and it still did not work." He looked at the engineering station, where the reactor status burned green and steady. "But 14 times it did. Because somebody kept trying." He looked back at me. "That is what I have been thinking about." I did not say anything. There was not anything useful to add to that. Ahead of us, the relay beacon came into sensor range, and beyond it the lane that led home. The UEF Admiralty hearing room on Earth Station Prime had a window that looked out at the docking arms, and from the seat where I was placed, a plain chair at a plain table, facing 7 people in fleet uniforms across a much larger and more formal table, I could see the docking arm where the Odyssey was berthed. She was visible from the window if you looked at the right angle. I looked at it often during the 6 hours I sat in that room. The hearing was called a review. In practice, it was an interrogation of every decision I had made from the moment I signed the transfer document at Scrapyard 9 to the moment the Odyssey completed her transit and requested docking clearance at Earth Station Prime. The 7 people across the table had read every log, every engineering report, every communication record, and Commander Dravik's official incident report, which had been filed through the Galactic Commerce Tribunal and had arrived at UEF Command approximately 3 hours before I did. The panel was chaired by Admiral Orrin Cross, who had the particular manner of senior fleet officers who have spent so much time being obeyed that they have partly forgotten what it feels like to be disagreed with. He was not unkind. He was thorough in the way of someone who takes thoroughness as a personal virtue and applies it to situations whether it helps or not. He began with the purchase, the mechanics of it, the legal standing, the registration process. He was satisfied with the documentation, which was complete. He moved to the reactor restart. He had the procedure in front of him, the Chapter 11 Section 4 procedure, and he read sections of it aloud, in a tone that suggested he found certain parts of it improbable. He asked who had authorized the attempt. I told him no one had, because there was no authority structure to authorize anything. I was a private citizen, on a vessel I owned, doing engineering work I was qualified to perform. This answer was accurate, and it was also the answer that caused him the most visible discomfort. He moved to the modifications. He went through each one: the point defense rewiring, the gravitational lens installation, the Thalari energy mesh adaptation. He asked detailed questions about the engineering rationale for each choice, and I gave detailed engineering answers that Glenn had helped me organize the night before in our berthing quarters, in a process that had taken 4 hours and was, Glenn said, the closest he had ever come to studying for a test. The Galactic Council observer on the panel, a Keth named Sovan, who had the horizontal mouth expression of deep focus, asked the most technically precise questions of anyone on the panel. Sovan had clearly read the Dravik incident report very carefully and had additional questions prepared beyond what the Admiralty had drafted. Sovan wanted to understand the pulse discharge, how it worked, what its range was, whether it could be defeated. I answered everything. There was no reason not to. The Odyssey's capabilities were already known to the Vreth Syndicate, which meant they would reach the Galactic Council shortly regardless of what I said in this room. After the pulse discharge, Sovan asked about the secondary weapons array and the non-standard connection configuration that Claire had found and activated. This was the question I had been most uncertain about how to answer, because it required me to say something true that reflected well on the original engineers and less well on the decommission process that had declared the ship worthless without discovering what she was actually carrying. I said it plainly. The connection had been designed by the original engineers. It was not in the external documentation. It had been hidden deliberately, as far as I could tell, behind the appearance of a standard backup system. The original engineers had built more capability into this ship than the official specification recorded, and they had concealed it in a way that would only reveal itself to someone who looked carefully and understood what they were seeing. Sovan leaned forward slightly at this. You are saying the ship was deliberately underspecified in her public documentation. I am saying the ship was more capable than her documentation reflected. Whether the discrepancy was deliberate is a conclusion I cannot draw from the engineering record alone. But you believe it was deliberate. I thought about the captain who had brought her home, the crew who had fought her past every limit, the engineers who had added supplemental plating that was not required, and run backup conduits through paths that made no logical sense, until they were the only conduits left. Yes, I said, I believe it was deliberate. Sovan made a note. I suspected that note was going to be the beginning of a very interesting internal investigation within some part of the UEF's historical record-keeping. Admiral Cross moved to the engagement. He went through it in exactly the sequence Dravik's report covered: the initial approach, the communications exchange, the repositioning of the portside escorts, the firing incident, the pulse discharge, the standoff, and the resolution. He asked me to account for each tactical decision. I accounted for them. I did not apologize for any of them. Cross asked, at one point, why I had not attempted to contact UEF Command during the standoff and request assistance. We were between relay beacons, I said. Dravik's approach vector was calculated to put us in that position. You could have maneuvered to reach a beacon range before the confrontation escalated. I could have attempted that. It would have required leaving the lane and using thrust capacity at a level that would have been read as evasive or aggressive behavior, and I was trying to de-escalate the situation, not accelerate it. I paused. I also calculated that UEF assistance, even if summoned immediately, would not arrive in time to affect the outcome. The outcome depended on what we did in the room we were in, not on who we could call. You made the assessment that you were capable of handling the situation yourself. I made the assessment that we were the only ones in a position to handle the situation, and that therefore we had to. Cross studied me across the table. He had the expression of someone working through a problem that has more variables than he initially expected. "Captain Voss," he said. I caught the word. "That is not my current rank," I said. "I left the fleet as chief engineer." "At this moment," Cross said, "you are operating a UEF auxiliary registered warship that has just conducted a defensive engagement against a Vreth Syndicate interdiction fleet and emerged fully functional, while disabling 3 enemy vessels without casualties on either side." He looked at the panel. "The Admiralty position is that the ship requires a current rank commanding officer." I was quiet for a moment. The Admiralty position, it turned out, was not a punishment, it was an offer. I had spent 6 hours assuming I was here to be held accountable for unauthorized military action, and somewhere in the last few minutes, the framing of the entire hearing had shifted, and I had missed the moment it shifted, because I was still looking at the window. "We want the Odyssey active," Cross said. "She is demonstrably operational, demonstrably capable, and demonstrably able to handle situations that our standard protocols do not cover adequately." He put his hands flat on the table. "We also want to understand the modifications more fully. There are implications in what you built there that go beyond a single ship." Sovan spoke again. "The Galactic Council has a parallel interest. The engagement record from the Dravek incident is going to raise questions across several member species about human engineering capability that are currently unanswered in our diplomatic documentation." "What kind of questions?" I said. Sovan's wide horizontal mouth did the thing that the Keth did when they were choosing words carefully. "The standard assumption, across most member species, has been that human engineering is functional, but not sophisticated. Competent for human operational needs, but not a significant factor in broader galactic capability assessments. The Dravek incident, combined with the technical documentation of this ship's modifications, suggests that assumption requires revision." I thought about Sket, standing outside the Odyssey's bay and laughing. Too many layers, too many backups, too much weight. "We build as if everything will go wrong," I said. "Yes," Sovan said. "I have read your testimony carefully, and that phrase in particular is going to be quoted in several council briefings. But what the council is concerned about is not the phrase. It is the implication. A species that builds as if everything will go wrong, and that has 700 years of accumulated experience with things going wrong, and finding ways to survive them anyway is," another pause, "not what the council's assessment files have been saying it is." I looked at Admiral Cross. "You want me to command her?" "We want you to command her," he said, "with full reinstatement. Glenn Archer as chief engineer, Claire Henning as weapons officer." I looked at the window. From where I was sitting, I could see the docking arm where the Odyssey was berthed, and I could see, or I imagined I could see, or I chose to see, the blunt, wide shape of her against the starfield, patient and present in the particular way she always was. I thought about what she had been when I found her, what the Vreth had seen when they looked at her, what their instruments had said she was, what they had paid to have her, and what they had thought they were buying, and what they had done with her once they had her, which was to strip the surface away, and conclude that what remained was not worth anything. I thought about my grandfather's annotations in the margins of a field manual, written in a slightly heavier hand than the rest of his notes. I thought about 14 times out of 22, and 8 times that did not work, and 14 times that did. "I accept," I said. The paperwork was completed that evening. The reinstatement documents, the official command assignment, the research commission that the Admiralty attached, which covered the modification work and authorized a formal study of alien component integration in human ship architecture, a study that would, over the next 2 years, change a number of things about how UEF vessels were designed. The Parallel Galactic Council inquiry, which Sovan managed, and which produced a document that I was told was classified at a very high level and that I never personally read, but the contents of which apparently caused several species to revisit their naval engineering practices. Glenn was genuinely pleased about the engineering commission. He shook my hand and said, "Now I get to write the Chapter 11 Section 4 documentation properly." Claire said that her weapons integration notes were already prepared for review. Lena, when I informed her of the command status change, said she had updated the ship's registration in the auxiliary system and asked whether I would be modifying her operational parameters. "No," I said. "Your parameters are fine." I have been doing a preliminary study of potential improvement to the gravitational lens calibration, Lena said. "If you are interested, send it to Glenn," I said. "He will tell you if it is viable." "I have already sent it to Glenn," Lena said. "He says it is viable and adds that it is also the kind of modification that should have been done 3 weeks ago." That was Glenn. I went to the docking arm that evening and boarded the Odyssey alone. I walked through her corridors in the quiet, with the ship humming around me at standby power, her systems stable and present, the sound of her in the walls and the floor exactly as it always was. I walked the full length of the intact sections. I stood in engineering for a while, with my hand on the reactor housing, feeling the vibration. I went up to the bridge and sat in the command chair. From the bridge windows I could see Earth Station Prime's outer ring, and through the gap between modules, a section of open space, and the distant star field that lay beyond everything we had built, and everything we had done, and everything that was still ahead. The Odyssey had been declared finished. The accountants had run their numbers and concluded that she was beyond the point where the investment of effort was justified. The Vreth had agreed with that conclusion. They had stripped her down to what they could sell and left the rest to go cold in a junkyard at the edge of nowhere, and they had been satisfied that they had correctly understood what she was and what she was worth. They had not been wrong that she was damaged. They had not been wrong that the repair cost was significant. What they had been wrong about was the value of what they would recover if the repair was made, because they had not understood what she was, not truly. A machine is not only its components. A machine is not only its systems or its documented specifications or its assessed condition on a given day. A machine is what it was designed to accomplish, and what it has accomplished, and what it will accomplish if someone with the knowledge and the will and the time makes the choices that need making. The same is true of people. I had left the fleet with a letter that thanked me for my contributions. The letter was accurate in everything it said, and completely wrong in its conclusion, which was that my contributions were in the past. They had looked at me the way the Vreth looked at the Odyssey, as something that had served its purpose, and was now an accounting problem, rather than an operational asset. They had not asked whether I could be restarted. I could be restarted. I was evidence of this. Gorvesh sent a message 6 weeks after the hearing. It was brief. He said that Sket had been removed from his position at Scrapyard 9 following the Keth Nebula Authority's discovery of the fraudulent ship manifests, which had been reported by an anonymous source. He said the yard had a new manager who was younger and not noticeably smarter than Sket, but who at least knew what human field manuals were. He said that if I was ever passing through, he had a Vreth navigation array that might be of interest. I sent back a message that said I would be in the area in approximately 3 months and to hold the array. He sent back, "Of course, I knew you would come back." I read that message in the command chair of the Odyssey, with the reactor humming below me, and the star field ahead of me, and Glenn's voice coming up from engineering, where he was already working on the gravitational lens calibration that Lena had sent him. Arguing cheerfully with Lena about the optimal field frequency, and Claire, at the weapons board, running a calibration drill that she ran every 3rd day because she believed, correctly, that a system that is not regularly tested is a system that will fail when tested by circumstances. We were ready for the lane. We were ready for whatever was in the lane. I opened the internal channel and said, "Lena, prepare for departure." "Departure systems are already at ready state," Lena said. "I prepared them 40 minutes ago, when the docking arm logged our clearance authorization." "Of course you did," I said. "Shall I notify Glenn and Claire?" "They already know," I said. "Because they did. Because that is the difference between a crew and a collection of people. A crew knows without being told, works without being watched, and trusts without needing to be asked. I looked out at the star field. Somewhere out there, the Keth Nebula ran its long, dark path through space, and at the edge of it, there was a scrapyard full of machines that had been declared finished, and some of them were finished, and some of them were not. And the difference between those two categories was not always what the people doing the declaring thought it was. "Let us go," I said. The Odyssey moved.